At the height of the 20th century, in the small towns and the large cities of the United States, a certain domestic scene had begun to repeat itself with almost liturgical regularity. It was Easter morning, or Halloween evening, or the last week of school before Christmas. And on a kitchen table, or in the bottom of a paper bag, or slipped into the corner of a lunchbox, was a very particular kind of small brown object, a rectangular bar wrapped in silver foil and printed paper, or a small round pellet with a colored shell and a single dry white letter stamped on it, that had, within the space of a single lifetime, become almost inseparable from the American idea of childhood. None of the children eating it could have said very much about where it came from. Almost none of the adults who bought it either. Somewhere in the middle distance of the American economy, there were two enormous factories, one of them in a Pennsylvania cornfield, one of them in a small industrial suburb of Chicago, where a certain kind of very reliable, very sweet, very specifically American chocolate was manufactured in unimaginable quantities and distributed without much ceremony to every corner drugstore and grocery aisle in the country. This is a documentary about those two factories, about the two men who built them, about the fact that one of the two men was, by every account of those who knew him, one of the kindest and most peculiar philanthropists of the American 20th century, and that the other of the two men was, by every account of those who knew him, one of the most difficult and most feared industrialists of that same century. And about the fact that, for the better part of 90 years, the companies they founded fought a very quiet, very lucrative, and occasionally very personal war on for control of the American chocolate aisle, a war whose outcome at the beginning of the 21st century was still not entirely settled. Subscribe for more documentaries on the great dynasties of old money. New episodes every week. Two men, two families, one product. And a great deal of silence at the end. Milton Snavely Hershey was born on the 13th of September, 1857, on a small farm in Derry Township in the Pennsylvania Dutch country, roughly 80 miles west of Philadelphia. His mother was Veronica Fanny Snavely, from a family of practicing Pennsylvania Mennonites. His father was Henry Hershey, a man whom every biographer who has since written about the family has described in some variation of the same phrase, a dreamer. Henry Hershey was, in the strictest sense, no more of a failure than any farmer of the 1860s who had a strong stomach for scheme. But he had, in addition to a farmer's ordinary willingness to work, a persistent conviction that the next scheme would be the one that finally lifted the family into comfort. And none of the schemes ever did. In the mid-1860s, the family lost their farm. The parents separated. The mother took her son and returned quietly to her Snavely relatives in Lancaster County. Milton left formal school at the age of 13. His father had first apprenticed him to a printer, a man named Samuel Ernst, in the small Pennsylvania town of Gap. The apprenticeship did not last. According to the biographical notes preserved in the archives of the Hershey community, the boy quite deliberately caused an accident with a straw hat, which fell into a printing press, in order to be dismissed. His mother resigned, then arranged for him to be apprenticed to a Lancaster confectioner named Joseph Royer at the age of 15. This apprenticeship he did not cause an accident to end. He finished it. He set up at the age of 19 on his own account in Philadelphia, and within a few years he failed. He tried again in Denver, briefly. He failed. He tried again in Chicago. He failed. He tried a third time in New York City in 1883, where he attempted to sell a caramel confection that he had learned to make with fresh milk, a technique he had picked up in Denver from a candy maker there. The New York venture also failed. In 1886, at the age of 29, Milton Hershey came home to Lancaster, on foot, having exhausted the last of his credit with a Philadelphia relative, and moved back in with his mother. He was, on the ordinary reckoning of the American 19th century, a failed man. He would not, by that reckoning, be much longer. In 1887 in Lancaster, with a very small loan from an aunt in a room borrowed above a plumber's shop, he founded the Lancaster Caramel Company. He used the fresh milk technique he had learned in Denver. The caramels were noticeably softer than the standard caramels of the American market and noticeably richer. Within 4 years, an English candy importer visiting Lancaster tasted them, placed a large order, and paid in a check drawn on a London bank. Within 8 years, Lancaster Caramel was the largest caramel manufacturer in the United States, employing more than 1,000 workers. And Milton Hershey was, for the first time in his life, a man with money in the bank. Then, in 1893, at the age of 36, he made a decision that no reasonable advisor would have recommended. He went to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The exposition, that summer, was the greatest single gathering of industrial machinery ever assembled on the American continent. Milton walked over the course of several days through the White City on the shore of Lake Michigan, the plaster and classical pavilions that Frederick Law Olmsted and Daniel Burnham had built for the fair. He looked at railway engines. He looked at electric dynamos. He looked at the first practical American Ferris wheel, and among the smaller pavilions, in a corner of the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building, he stopped at a small German exhibit, a booth run by a Dresden confectioner named Lehman, demonstrating a machine that manufactured chocolate. Milton Hershey stood in front of the machine for the better part of an afternoon. He watched it heat and mix in conchaux, the process by which molten chocolate is worked over a heated stone until its texture becomes smooth. At the end of the afternoon, he made an offer for the whole assembly. The Dresden confectioner, according to the accounts that survive in the Hershey Community Archives, was surprised, but he accepted. The machine was crated. It was shipped to Lancaster. And Milton Hershey, at the height of his commercial success in caramel, began experimenting, quietly, with a product that almost no American manufacturer of the time believed had any mass-market future. Chocolate, in the American market of the 1890s, was a European specialty. It was expensive, it was fragile in warm weather. It required imported cocoa beans, which arrived in unpredictable quantities from Central and South America. And it required, above all, a technique for combining cocoa with fresh milk that no American producer had yet solved. Milton Hershey took 7 years to solve it. He never patented the recipe. According to the tradition of the Hershey factory, transmitted for generations by the workers who ran the mills, the crucial insight involved a slow, low-temperature process that gave the finished bar a particular tangy note, a slight acidic edge that would come to define the American taste for chocolate for the entire following century. It is not the taste of European milk chocolate. Any European visitor comparing a Hershey bar to a Cadbury or a Lindt will comment quite unfavorably on the difference. That difference, however, is what an American child of the 20th century would come to understand as the taste of chocolate itself. In 1900, at the height of Lancaster Caramel's success, Milton Hershey sold the entire caramel company for $1 million, an enormous sum for a small Pennsylvania town, and used the money to concentrate exclusively on chocolate. Then he did the thing that no one who knew him had expected. He bought a large tract of farmland in Derry Township, the same township where he had been born, and he began to build, on a strip of open field with no existing town around it, the largest chocolate factory in the world. Beside the factory, he laid out streets, and beside the streets, he built houses, and beside the houses, he built a bank and a trolley system, and a school and a park and a public library, and, in due course, a hospital and an entertainment complex and a golf course, and, of all things, a rose garden of nearly 100 acres. He named the place, without much imagination, after himself. It became, in 1903, the town of Hershey, Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1898, on the 25th of May in New York City, he had done the other thing that no one who knew him had expected. He had married. Her name was Catherine Elizabeth Sweeney. She was born in Jamestown in western New York on the 6th of July, 1871, 14 years his junior. She was Irish-American, the daughter of Michael and Catherine Sweeney of the Jamestown Catholic community. She was, by every surviving account, small, quick-tongued, warm, and thoroughly unmoved by the practical solemnity of the Pennsylvania Mennonite tradition, into which she had quite unexpectedly married. Milton had met her on one of his sales trips north in a confectionery shop in Jamestown, and had returned and returned again and returned a third time. On the 25th of May, 1898, they were married. He was 40 years old. They lived for the first years of their marriage in the mansion Milton had built on a hill above the new chocolate factory. He called it High Point. She called it, in a phrase her nieces later remembered, the loveliest prison in Pennsylvania. She was ill more often than she was well. She could not, according to the medical vocabulary of the time, bear children, which was, as those who loved her would later say, the sorrow around which the rest of her life was arranged. In 1909, at her particular urging, she and Milton signed a deed of trust establishing an industrial school for orphaned boys on the grounds of a small farm outside the town to be funded from the profits of the chocolate company. It was called, at the time, the Hershey Industrial School. It would in time be called the Milton Hershey School. She did not live long enough to see it grow. In the winter of 1915, her health broke. She had been declining for years from a condition the doctors of the time could not name, and the doctors of a later century have never confidently identified, a progressive weakness that stripped her, month by month, of her ability to walk unaided, then to sit upright, then to hold a book. Milton, at the end, took her to Philadelphia in a private railway car, in the hope of a specialist consultation at a university hospital. She was taken to the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. On the 25th of March, in her room at the hotel, in the presence of her husband and a physician, she died. She was 43 years old. He had loved her, according to those who knew them both, in the particular way of a man who had not expected, in middle age, to be loved back. Milton Hershey did not remarry. He carried her photograph, according to those who traveled with him afterward, for the remainder of his life. He also, quite quietly in the year after her death, commissioned a small stone mausoleum in the cemetery he had built on a hill above the town, and he arranged for his own eventual crypt to be prepared adjacent to hers. 3 years after her death, in the autumn of 1918, a decision made privately and not made public for another 5 years, he transferred every single share of the Hershey Chocolate Company that he owned into a trust for the benefit of the Milton Hershey School. He gave it all away. He kept, for himself, only his salary, his house, and the right to run the company for as long as he was fit to do so. When his lawyer, upon reviewing the deed, observed that the arrangement was, in the strictest legal sense, irrevocable, Milton Hershey confirmed, according to accounts that circulated later, that irrevocability was precisely what he had wanted. When the Depression came in 1929 and the chocolate company's earnings collapsed by a third, he did not lay off workers. He announced instead a program of public construction, the Great Building Campaign, under which more than 600 men from the town of Hershey were paid to build a hotel, a theater, a sports arena, a stadium, a community center, and the new buildings of the Milton Hershey School. Every building was constructed by hand, in stone or brick, by workers he insisted be paid in cash rather than in relief coupons. When someone in his office observed to him in 1932 that the country was building far more construction than it could ever use, he replied, according to a story the workers themselves preserved, "I don't understand it. I'm giving these men a chance to eat." In 1945, 3 days after his 88th birthday, on the 13th of October, Milton Hershey died of pneumonia in the Hershey Hospital that he had, 22 years earlier, built. He was buried in the Hershey Cemetery, beside Catherine, in the mausoleum that he had commissioned within a year of her death, and that he had visited, according to those who accompanied him, almost every Sunday afternoon of the remaining 30 years of his own life. At the time of his death, the Hershey Chocolate Corporation was the largest chocolate manufacturer in the United States, by a considerable margin. He had no children of his own. He had, in the trust he had established 27 years earlier, roughly 1,000. Some fortunes, in the end, are given away before they are properly counted. The other story begins with a limp. Franklin Clarence Mars was born on the 24th of September, 1883, in a small settlement in Pope County, Minnesota, some 200 miles northwest of Minneapolis. His parents were, at the time of his birth, 22 and 21 years old. They were farm laborers, and they did not have very much. When Franklin was 4 years old, he contracted polio, the condition then known as infantile paralysis. And although he survived the illness, he was left with a permanent limp on one leg and, according to family accounts, a permanent reluctance to walk long distances without a cane. His mother, Alva, kept him indoors that winter and taught him, by way of amusement, the small confectioner's trick of hand-dipping candy into melted chocolate. He was, by the time he entered school, already able to make a passable caramel. By the time he was 12, he was selling candy of his own manufacture to the neighbors. By the time he was 19, in 1902, he was operating in a rented room in Minneapolis, a small wholesale candy concern that supplied the small shopkeepers of the Twin Cities. That same year, he married a schoolteacher named Ethel Gale Kissack. In 1904, on the 21st of March, their only son was born. They named him Forrest Edward Mars. The marriage did not last. By 1910, Frank and Ethel had divorced. She kept the boy. She moved with him first to North Dakota and then eventually across the border into the Canadian province of Saskatchewan to be near her own relatives. Forrest Mars, from the age of 6, did not routinely see his father. What he received from his father at Christmas and at birthdays was a package of candy, Frank's own product, accompanied sometimes by a short handwritten note. Frank, meanwhile, married again in 1910. His second wife was Ethel Veronica Healy, a spirited young woman from Petersburg, North Dakota. It was in the way of a certain kind of Midwestern coincidence, a coincidence that the Mars family later never entirely knew what to do with, that the man's first wife and his second wife bore, in common, the name Ethel. In the family, and in what little press coverage the family would in later years permit, they were carefully distinguished as Ethel G. and Ethel V. Ethel V. moved with Frank to Tacoma, Washington in 1911, and together they opened the Mars Candy Factory, a small storefront on Pacific Avenue that sold buttercream chocolates to shopkeepers of the Tacoma waterfront. The business failed. They tried again in Seattle. It failed. They tried a third time. It failed also. In 1920, exhausted and nearly broke, Frank and Ethel V. moved to Minneapolis, and with almost the last of their savings, Frank founded a new company, the Mar-O-Bar Company, in a small industrial building on East 26th Street. It was there, over the following 3 years, that Frank Mars did what he had been failing to do for 2 decades. He invented a candy bar that people quite simply could not stop buying. The bar was called the Milky Way. It was introduced in 1923. Its central idea was, on the strictest reading, not Frank's own. According to family accounts preserved in the Mars corporate archives, the idea for the bar had come in a Chicago drugstore from Frank's own 19-year-old son, Forrest, the son he had scarcely seen since the divorce. Forrest, on a summer visit to his father, had watched a shop clerk mix a chocolate malted milkshake at a soda fountain, and had turned to his father and said, in what would later become a much-repeated family sentence, "Why can't you put a chocolate malted drink in a candy bar?" Frank could. He did. He whipped chocolate-flavored nougat into a soft, aerated center, poured a caramel over the top, and coated the entire bar in a thin milk chocolate shell. Wrapped in a blue and white paper printed with a small illustration of the Milky Way galaxy, it went on sale in Minneapolis in the summer of 1923. Within a single year, it was outselling every other candy bar in the Midwest. Within 3 years, Mar-O-Bar was the second largest candy manufacturer in the United States, behind only the by now formidable Hershey Chocolate Company in Pennsylvania. In 1929, Frank renamed the company Mars Incorporated. In the same year, he moved his family and his factory from Minneapolis to Chicago and settled in the wealthy suburb of River Forest, Illinois. Over the following 4 years, he introduced 2 more products, each of which entered the American vocabulary. In 1930, he introduced Snickers, a candy bar of nougat, peanuts, caramel, and milk chocolate, named after his wife's favorite horse. In 1932, he introduced the Three Musketeers Bar A, originally, as its name implied, a package of 3 separate small bars in 3 flavors: chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla, which the wartime rationing of the following decade would reduce to a single bar of chocolate. In the late 1920s, he bought some 2,800 acres of farmland in Giles County, Tennessee, and began the construction of an enormous private estate. He named it Milky Way Farm. It contained a 25,000 square foot clubhouse designed in the Tudor Revival style, more than 30 barns, a horse racing track, a show horse track, and a private airstrip. On the roofs of the largest barns he had painted, in yellow letters visible from the sky, the words Milky Way, so that the small commercial aircraft flying between Nashville and Memphis would, when they passed overhead, see the name of the candy bar that had, in the space of 6 years, built the estate beneath them. He hired more than 900 men from Giles County during the construction. He raised thoroughbred racehorses, one of which, a colt named Galahadian, foaled after Frank's own death, would in 1940 win the Kentucky Derby in his widow's colors at odds of 35-1. He was 51 years old and he was one of the wealthiest men in the American Midwest. None of his fortune, meanwhile, had reached his son Forrest, who was, by then, 25 years old, a graduate in industrial engineering from Yale University, and, on Frank's own reluctant re-invitation, working in the Mars factory in Chicago as a junior executive. Forrest had come initially as a summer employee in the shipping department. He had made himself useful. He had studied the production lines. He had submitted in his second year a written proposal for what he considered to be a comprehensive restructuring of the sales and distribution operation of the Mars Company. His father had read it. His father had then, according to those who worked in the office at the time, walked into the shipping department, placed the document on Forrest's desk without opening it further, and said nothing. They fought. The fights were, by all accounts, not the ordinary business disagreements of a father and a competent adult son. They were the fights of a man who had raised himself and a man who had been raised by a distant single mother, and who now met in middle age as strangers wearing similar suits and speaking a professional language of profit margins and distribution routes that neither of them believed adequate to what they actually had to say to one another. The father, in his more difficult moods, is reported to have observed that his son had not spent enough time on a shop floor to understand what candy was for. The son, in his more difficult moods, is reported to have observed that his father had not spent enough time in a boardroom to understand what a national brand was going to require in the coming decade to survive. The final argument, in the spring of 1932, was about geography. Forrest wanted to expand the company into Europe. Frank refused. Frank wanted, as he told the boy in a phrase later reported by the Mars biographer Joel Glenn Brenner, to keep the business small and in the family. Forrest, who had spent his entire youth watching that family fail to be a family, made an offer. "Give me a stake in the international rights. Give me a few of the recipes. Let me go." Frank agreed. He handed his son the foreign manufacturing rights to the Milky Way bar and a settlement of some $50,000. Forrest, with the money and the recipes, sailed for England. 2 years later, on the 8th of April, 1934, Frank Mars died in Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, of complications from what the attending physicians described as heart and kidney disease, after a 10-day illness that had, according to the reports of the following week, come on quite suddenly during a business trip east from Chicago. He was 50 years old. Forrest in Slough was informed of his father's death by cable. He did not cross the Atlantic for the funeral. What communications, if any, had passed between the two of them in the final days remains unrecorded in any documentary source that has since become public. If any of you have access to letters from that period that survive in a family archive, leave a comment below. His stepmother, Ethel V., inherited the controlling interest in Mars Incorporated. She would run it with a small circle of managers for the next 11 years. She died on Christmas Day of 1945, the same year, oddly, in which Milton Hershey died in Pennsylvania, and left her share of the company, per the terms of Frank's will, to be divided in ways that the son, in England, would spend the following 2 decades quietly disputing and, in the end, wholly overturning. Some fortunes, in the end, are not so much inherited as taken back. To understand what Forrest Mars Sr. did in the 20 years after his father's death, one has to understand first what he had done in the 2 years before it. He had arrived in England in the summer of 1932 with $50,000, the international rights to the Milky Way bar, and a very particular kind of anger. He was 28 years old. He had been rebuffed on what he considered to be an unjust point by a father who had already rejected him once. He had a wife, Audrey Ruth Meyer, whom he had married in 1930, and that same year an infant son whom they had named Forrest Edward Mars Jr., called the second. He had no friends in England. He had no factory. He had no distributors. And he had, according to those who worked with him in that first year, absolutely no intention of failing. He rented a small industrial premises in the town of Slough, some 20 miles west of London. He hired 8 men. He worked at first without a salary of his own. He reformulated the Milky Way recipe for the British palate. The British, he had determined, preferred a slightly firmer nougat and a slightly less sweet caramel, and renamed the bar because of trademark difficulties with an existing British confection of the same name, the Mars Bar. It went on sale in September of 1932. Within 18 months, it was one of the best-selling candy bars in Great Britain. He did not stop. In 1935, he entered the pet food business, founding a small British company called Chapel Brothers Limited that made canned meat for dogs, the origin of what would in later decades become the enormous Mars Pet Care division. In 1936, he introduced Maltesers, a small round chocolate-covered malted milk ball that would in due course become, in Britain, one of the most beloved confections of the 20th century. And in the same period he took, for reasons that he was not entirely willing to explain later, a series of long working visits to Switzerland, where he studied quietly in the factories of Nestlé and of the Bernese confectioner Tobler, the industrial processes for producing very high-quality chocolate at very high volumes. He returned to Slough with several notebooks of production notes and, by the standards of the British confectionery industry of the mid-1930s, an alarmingly comprehensive understanding of continental technique. Then, in 1937, he made a trip to Spain. The Spanish Civil War was then in its second year. Forrest Mars, on what he later described as a purely commercial fact-finding visit, traveled through Republican-controlled territory in a hired car with a British driver on the outskirts of the campaign for Zaragoza. On one afternoon at a village crossroads where a column of soldiers had stopped in the shade of an olive grove, he watched a group of them eating, from a small tin, a candy of a kind he had never seen before. The candy consisted of a small pellet of chocolate surrounded by a hard-colored shell of tempered sugar. The shell prevented the chocolate from melting. It could be carried in a soldier's pocket in July, in the mountains of Aragon, without turning to paste. Forrest Mars, who had spent 5 years watching British chocolate bars go soft in the summer months and had personally lost, in his own account books, several thousand pounds of stock to melting in a single warm week of 1935, understood immediately what he was looking at. He returned to Slough. He asked a British confectioner, whose name has not survived in the archives, to reproduce the shell technique. Within a few weeks he could. But he could not, in the political climate of 1939, secure the industrial-scale supply of chocolate and sugar that he would need to bring the product to a mass market. In September of that year, when the war in Europe began, he made a decision. He left the British company in the hands of his managers, and he sailed home to the United States. He arrived in New York in 1939 or 1940. He was 35 years old. He had a wife, 3 children, Forrest Jr., born 1931, John Franklin, born 1935 in Arlington, Virginia, and Jacqueline, born 1939 in Washington, and a piece of intellectual property, unpatented and largely unknown outside the specialized confectionery trade, that he believed could be the largest candy invention of the 20th century. He needed, however, a supply of chocolate. And American chocolate in the last months of 1940 and the opening months of 1941 was becoming rationed in anticipation of a war that had not yet officially begun. The single American company that had a long-term supply agreement with the United States military for chocolate an agreement that gave it, in practice, first call on the country's imported cocoa was, of course, the Hershey Chocolate Corporation of Pennsylvania. Forrest Mars, age 36, went to Hershey. He did not, however, approach Milton Hershey directly. He approached, quite deliberately, the son of Hershey's chief sales executive, a young man named Bruce Murray. Bruce Murray was the son of William Fr., who had been Milton Hershey's general manager since 1896. William Murray had, in the intervening 44 years, become, in effect, the man who ran the Hershey Corporation on the practical business side while Milton concentrated on the town and the school. He was also, and this was the fact that Forrest Mars had presumably researched before he arrived, in the middle of a slow, difficult falling out with his own son over the direction of the Hershey Corporation. Bruce, according to the Hershey archives, had wanted to accelerate the company's move into new product categories. His father, and Milton behind his father, had wanted to slow it down. Bruce Murray, in short, was a young man of the exact temperamental profile Forrest was looking for, an heir who was ready to leave. They struck a deal in the winter of 1940. Bruce Murray would provide, through his father's connections at Hershey, an assured supply of chocolate and sugar throughout the coming rationing period. Forrest Mars would provide the manufacturing process, the patent, and the capital for a new factory. The two men would split the profits 80-20 in favor of Mars and would name the resulting product after their two surnames. On the 3rd of March 1941, Forrest Mars was granted a United States patent for a process for the manufacture of a candy consisting of a small pellet of chocolate coated with a hard sugar shell. Production began within weeks at a factory in Newark, New Jersey. The product was distributed exclusively to the United States military as part of soldiers' rations. It traveled to North Africa, to Italy, to the Philippines, and eventually to Normandy, in cardboard tubes marked with a small pair of overlapping letters, M and M. By the end of the Second World War, American soldiers who had spent 4 years eating M&Ms in tropical latitudes were coming home. The product went on general sale. Within 3 years, it was one of the best-selling candies in the United States. And on a certain afternoon in 1948, in a meeting the details of which were never made public, Forrest Mars sat down with Bruce Murray in a Newark office and made him an offer for his 20% share of the company. The offer, according to figures later confirmed by both sides, was $1 million. Bruce Murray accepted. He was, at the time of the sale, still in his late 30s. He did not, so far as the American candy industry ever afterward recorded, do anything of comparable note in the confectionery business for the remaining decades of his working life. Forrest Mars now owned M&Ms outright and the Newark factory that produced them. He also, meanwhile, owned the British Mars Company that produced the Mars Bar and Maltesers, and a small collection of other food ventures, including, by 1943, a rice processing partnership with a Texan businessman that would in due course become the Uncle Ben's brand that he ran from a small headquarters in the Washington suburb of McLean, Virginia, with a management structure of no more than 50 people at the head office. And in 1964, having spent the previous 16 years watching his father's original American Mars, Incorporated slowly lose market share to his own separate operations, he made his final move. He offered his half-siblings and stepmother's heirs, the descendants who had, after Frank's death and after Ethel V's death, jointly inherited the original Chicago-based Mars, Incorporated, a stock swap. He would fold his own American and British companies into theirs and take, in return, controlling stock in the combined enterprise. The offer was accepted without significant public opposition. The Newark M&M's operation and the Slough Mars Bar operation became, from that year, subsidiaries of Mars, Incorporated. And Forrest Mars Sr., age 60, became, for the first time in his life, the chief executive of the family firm his father had, 32 years earlier, sent him away from. He was not a warm chief executive. He was, according to those who worked under him in the McLean headquarters in the 1960s, capable of firing a senior manager for a badly typed memorandum. He was known, in a phrase later attributed to a Mars executive who eventually left the company, to arrive at the head office at 7 in the morning, walk the length of the production floor with a stopwatch in his hand, and refuse to acknowledge on his walk any employee who had not personally been introduced to him in advance. He kept the corporate accounts in a system of his own design. He forbade the company to issue press releases. He forbade internal telephone directories that gave any employee's home address. And he introduced, in the middle of that decade, an organizational principle that Mars, Incorporated, has followed under one form or another ever since. The principle that no member of the extended family and no senior executive was to appear in a photograph published outside the internal company magazine. He was also, in that same decade, the man who took the deliberate strategic decision that would define the American chocolate industry for the remaining decades of the 20th century. He informed the Hershey Chocolate Corporation in 1964 that Mars would no longer be purchasing chocolate from them. Mars would build its own cocoa processing capacity. It would source its own beans. It would refine, roast, and conch its own supply. 6 years later, in 1970, the company would purchase, in the small Pennsylvania town of Elizabethtown, some 15 miles west of Hershey itself, an existing chocolate factory known as Klein Chocolate, and turn it into what would in time become the largest cocoa processing facility in the eastern United States. It would, in effect, stop being Hershey's largest single customer and start being Hershey's largest single competitor, from a factory located, deliberately and provocatively, within an hour's drive of Milton Hershey's grave. The war was on. Some sons, in the end, spend their lives not competing with their fathers, but completing them. Forrest Mars Sr. retired from Mars, Incorporated in 1973. He was 69 years old. He turned the company over to his 3 children, Forrest Jr., John, and Jacqueline, with the specific instruction that no member of the family was to speak to the press about the company ever on any subject. The children obeyed him. 2 of them, for the rest of their lives, would not sit for a single on-the-record interview with any American news organization. The third, Forrest Jr., would give exactly one decades later on the subject of colonial-era chocolate making to a curator at the Smithsonian. Meanwhile, in the state of Pennsylvania, in the town that Milton Hershey had built beside a cornfield in 1903, the Hershey Chocolate Corporation was in trouble. Not visible trouble, not published trouble. The company was still the largest chocolate manufacturer in the United States. It was still profitable. It was still, technically, the market leader in the American candy aisle. But at some point between 1964 and 1973, historians of the industry disagree on the exact year the annual sales of Mars, Incorporated, had quietly overtaken those of Hershey. And Hershey, by every one of the indicators that an internal marketing department could produce, was losing ground on each product category that mattered. Part of the problem was cultural. The Hershey Corporation had, since Milton's death in 1945, been run by a succession of engineers and financial managers who had, in most cases, been brought up in the Hershey Company town, been educated at Milton Hershey School or at Pennsylvania State University, and been promoted from within the Pennsylvania organization. They knew on the level of the smallest technical detail exactly how a Hershey Kiss should be manufactured. They knew almost nothing about advertising. Milton Hershey had, throughout his lifetime, refused to advertise his product at all. He had considered the practice undignified. The corporation, in the years after his death, had partly maintained the same principle. In 1969, Hershey spent, on all forms of consumer advertising for its entire product line, less than $1.5 million. Mars, in the same year, spent more than 20 times that amount. The turning point in the internal history of the Hershey Corporation came in 1976. In that year, the board of the Hershey Chocolate Corporation appointed, as its new chief executive officer, a man named William Dearden. Dearden was 55 years old. He had spent his entire career at Hershey, and he had come to the company by a route that no other candy chief executive in the world had ever come by. William Dearden was an orphan. He had been enrolled in the Milton Hershey School at the age of 5 in the mid-1920s. He had been fed at Milton Hershey's expense. He had been housed in a dormitory built during the Great Building Campaign that Milton had funded at the height of the Depression. He had been trained in his teens in one of the industrial trades the school taught. He had gone to college on a Hershey Trust scholarship. He had come back to the town, taken a junior sales position at the Chocolate Corporation in 1957, and worked his way, over the following 19 years, into the executive suite. When the board offered him the chief executive's chair in 1976, he accepted with, according to those who were in the room, one particular observation. He said that he owed the town of Hershey and the man who had built it everything he had. He proposed, therefore, to run the company as though Milton Hershey were still watching. Under Dearden, the Hershey Corporation did what it had never done. It began systematically to advertise. It hired a New York agency. It commissioned television spots. It launched the Reese's Pieces campaign, a colored candy-coated peanut butter product that had been in the company's line since 1978, and that Dearden's marketing team now placed aggressively in front of the American public. It agreed in 1982 to what would become one of the most celebrated product placements in the history of American cinema. A young Californian director had approached the Mars Company that spring with a request to use a small trail of M&Ms in a scene of a family film he was then completing. The film involved a suburban California boy, a garage, and a small extraterrestrial creature who could be lured into the boy's home by the trail of candy. The director explained the concept to a Mars executive by telephone. The Mars executive, in accordance with the standing corporate instruction on all matters of publicity, refused. The director then telephoned the Hershey Corporation. Dearden's marketing office understood immediately what had just fallen into their lap. They agreed. The candy in the film was accordingly changed from M&Ms to Reese's Pieces. The film, released in June of 1982, was E.T. the Extraterrestrial. In the 4 months after the film opened, sales of Reese's Pieces increased threefold. It was, according to industry historians who would later write the case study, one of the single most consequential product placement transactions in the history of American consumer marketing. It was made possible entirely by the Mars family's constitutional inability, at that moment, to say yes to a stranger on a telephone. Under Dearden's successor, Richard A. Zimmerman, who took over in 1984, Hershey continued the counteroffensive. Zimmerman diversified the company's product line, added the Twizzlers licorice brand through the acquisition of the Y&S Candies Company, and by the middle of the decade had brought Hershey's annual advertising budget up to a level comparable to that of Mars. And in 1988, in the single largest transaction in Hershey's corporate history, Zimmerman authorized the acquisition of the United States confectionery operations of the British firm Cadbury Schweppes for approximately $300 million, bringing under the Hershey umbrella, in one movement, the Almond Joy and Mounds and York Peppermint Patty and Peter Paul brands, together with the licensing rights to the Cadbury Dairy Milk name in the American market. With the Cadbury acquisition, the American market share balance shifted for the first time in a decade and a half. In 1988, Hershey, once again, was the largest chocolate manufacturer in the United States. Mars had held the position for approximately 15 years. It would not, in the following 4 decades, permanently reclaim it. Meanwhile, in McLean, Virginia, the 3 surviving children of Forrest Mars Sr., Forrest Jr., John Franklin, and Jacqueline Yee, ran the Mars Company jointly, in a corporate culture whose watchword was the single unchanging instruction their father had given them at the point of retirement: never talk to the press. When their father died in Miami on the 1st of July, 1999, at the age of 95, they released through the company's spokesman a single sentence acknowledging his death and no further details of any kind. When Forrest Jr. himself died in Seattle on the 26th of July, 2016, of a heart attack at the age of 84, the company released a similarly brief statement. He had been one of the wealthiest men in the world. His net worth at the time of his death was estimated at more than $25 billion. There was no public memorial service. Milton Hershey, in the same month of the same year, sold roughly $100 million worth of chocolate. The Milton Hershey School, meanwhile, in its capacity as the majority beneficial owner of the Hershey Chocolate Corporation, Enrolled in that same academic year, roughly 2,000 orphaned or economically disadvantaged children at no cost to their families in 12 grades of education on the campus that Milton had built for them 107 years earlier. The endowment of the school at that point had passed $17 billion. It was, by a comfortable margin, the largest single institution educational endowment in the United States on a per-student basis. It had reached that figure through nothing more complicated than the 98 years of profits reinvested and compounded from the sale of milk chocolate bars, the same milk chocolate bars that Milton Hershey had first begun to make in a rented Lancaster workshop in 1894. In 2008, in a transaction that briefly and unexpectedly returned the Mars family to the American business pages, John Franklin Mars and his siblings, through Mars Incorporated, jointly purchased the William Wrigley Jr. Company, the Chicago-based manufacturer of chewing gum and mint confections, for $23 billion. Half the financing for the deal came from the Berkshire Hathaway investment vehicle of Warren Buffett. The remainder came from the Mars family's own retained earnings, accumulated over 4 decades of a corporate policy of paying almost no dividends. It was, at the time of its announcement, the single largest privately negotiated food industry acquisition in American history. The company that emerged, the combined Mars-Wrigley confectionery operation, became briefly the largest sweets manufacturer in the world and reasserted for the first time in 20 years a Mars family lead over Hershey in the American market. It was announced through a single joint press release. Neither John Mars nor Jacqueline Mars gave an on-the-record interview about the transaction. In August of 2024, Mars Incorporated announced its intention to acquire, for approximately $36 billion, the Chicago-based food conglomerate Kellanova, the manufacturer of Pop-Tarts, Pringles, and the Cheez-It cracker line, in what would, on completion, become the largest food industry acquisition of the 21st century to that date. The deal was formally announced on the 14th of August, 2024, by joint statement of the two boards. It received Kellanova shareholder approval that November. It cleared its final regulatory hurdle at the European Commission in Brussels on the 8th of December, 2025. It closed 3 days later. Neither of the two surviving Mars siblings was quoted in any of the corresponding press releases. The Kellanova acquisition placed under the ownership of a single American family the manufacturing of a truly extraordinary proportion of the packaged snack food consumed by the American population, a proportion that neither Milton Hershey nor Frank Mars, in the 1890s or the 1920s, could have imagined would ever be assembled under a single roof. Some rivalries, in the end, are settled less on the balance sheet than on the question of what the money was all along for. Return, for a moment, to the kitchen table and the paper bag and the small brown object wrapped in silver foil. A child in the United States in the year 1999, in the year Forrest Mars Sr. died, was slightly more likely to be eating a Mars family product than a Hershey product, but only by a few percentage points. That same child, in the year 2025, is slightly more likely to be eating a Hershey product than a Mars product, but again only by a few percentage points. The American chocolate market at the beginning of the 21st century is a duopoly. It has been a duopoly for very close to 100 years. And the terms of the duopoly are, in a way that almost no American consumer thinks about while opening a candy wrapper on a train platform, extraordinary. On one side of the duopoly stands the Hershey Company. It is publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Its majority controlling shareholder, through a trust holding roughly 78% of the voting power in the corporation, is a private residential school for orphaned and economically disadvantaged children in Pennsylvania. That school, at the time of writing, has an endowment of more than $17 billion, one of the largest per capita endowments in the American educational system, and enrolls at any given moment roughly 2,100 students from kindergarten through the 12th grade at zero cost to their families. Every one of those students eats chocolate that has, in a real financial sense, been paid for by the profits of the corporation whose stock funds the school in which they are being educated. It is not an inefficient arrangement. It has been running in almost exactly the current form since the deed of trust signed by Milton and Catherine Hershey in 1909. On the other side of the duopoly stands Mars Incorporated. It is privately held. Its stock is not traded on any public exchange. Its ownership, at the time of writing, is divided among two of the three surviving children of Forrest Mars Sr., John Franklin Mars and Jacqueline Mars, both of whom are in their late 80s, and among the four adult daughters of the third child, Forrest Jr., who died in 2016. The two surviving siblings do not, in any published record, appear together in public. They have not sat in the 26 years since their father's death for a joint interview. The company they inherited had, in 2024, an annual revenue of over $50 billion. It is, by that measure, the largest privately held food company in the world. The two enterprises, in other words, have chosen almost exactly opposite ways of surviving into the 21st century. Hershey has continued to do what Milton Hershey did, to make chocolate and to fund, through the making of chocolate, an institution designed to correct, in the small circle of children it can reach, the accident of an unlucky birth. Mars has continued to do what Forrest Sr. did, to make chocolate in enormous, industrially disciplined quantities, and to leave, to the family that inherits it, an obligation to preserve, above all other obligations, the family's absolute privacy. Neither of these is, on its face, a mad way to live. Neither of them is quite what an outsider might have expected either, from a Pennsylvania caramel maker who came home broke to his mother in 1886, or from a Minnesota polio survivor who taught his boy to hand-dip chocolate on a farm kitchen table in the 1880s. What they had in common, Milton Hershey and Frank Mars, was that they both understood, before almost anyone else in America understood, that a small brown rectangle of sugar and cocoa and milk fat could become, in the 20th century, one of the essential daily pleasures of the industrial working class. What they had, in other words, was the same insight, arrived at almost simultaneously in two different states by two men who never met. What their descendants had on the two sides of the war could scarcely have been more different. On the Hershey side, an unbroken succession of engineers and orphans, running a corporation whose profits were, in a very literal sense, not their own. On the Mars side, a single family whose founding grievance, a father and a son who could not, in any decade of their overlapping lives, quite manage to talk to one another, became in the end the corporate culture of the company they built. There is in the Hershey Cemetery, on a hill above the town Milton Hershey built, a small stone mausoleum. It is not, by the standards of the Gilded Age mausolea one finds in the great cemeteries of Boston or Philadelphia, an elaborate structure. It is a single small chamber of gray Pennsylvania stone with a plain iron door and no inscriptions of any philosophical distinction on the outside. Inside, in adjacent crypts, lie Milton Snavely Hershey and Catherine Elizabeth Sweeney Hershey. There are no children in the mausoleum. There have never been any children in the mausoleum. There were never any Hershey children. On weekends throughout the year, however, and particularly on the Sundays of the school term, the small road that runs past the mausoleum is used by the students of the Milton Hershey School, who walk up the hill from their dormitories, on the way to the athletic fields at the top of the ridge. They pass the mausoleum, most of them without particular ceremony. Some of them do stop. There is in the Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis a private stone mausoleum of a very similar scale. It is set on a small rise beside a stand of oak trees. Inside it lie Franklin Clarence Mars, his second wife Ethel Veronica Healy Mars, and, since 1999, his son Forrest Edward Mars Sr. The son who spent the last 2 years of his father's life on a different continent, refusing to come home, is buried 3 feet from the man he refused to come home to. There are, so far, no other Mars family members in the mausoleum. The two surviving children of Forrest Sr., in accordance with the general instruction of the company they now run, have not, at the time of this recording, made public any plans for their own eventual burial. In due course, presumably, decisions will be made and made privately. Some feuds in the end outlive both of the men who started them and everything they were fighting for.